Imagine for a second that, you're watching the news and an authoritarian regime, one that has held absolute power for decades, finally cracks.
Right.
The dictator flees or steps down or passes away. What happens next? We have this tendency, like this Hollywood-driven expectation to think the very next morning is just an instant dawn of democracy.
Oh, yeah, the sun rises, the birds sing.
Exactly. And people are just freely voting at the ballot box.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that the moment an autocracy breaks, a nation doesn't just step into the light. It enters this highly volatile, incredibly dangerous gray zone.
Yeah, and that gray zone is where history actually happens. I mean, for better or worse. It's that precarious space right between the collapse of the old order and, well, the birth of whatever comes next.
And that gray zone is exactly what we're pulling apart today in this deep dive. We're looking specifically at the powder keg in Iran right now. And just looking through the stack of sources we've got, intelligence reports from 2026, economic analyses, transitology papers, it's clear that crisis management during this shift from authoritarianism to democratic governance is, well, it's like walking a razor's edge.
It really is. And to really grasp the gravity of this, you have to understand that periods of transition are inherently volatile because of something called the crisis multiplier effect.
It's crisis multiplier effect.
Right. So in a transitional phase, you're dealing with incredibly weak institutions, fragmented political authority, and just massive public distrust.
Okay.
Because of those factors, what might normally be a manageable economic shock, say like a sudden drop in currency value or a localized protest over water, suddenly that escalates into a systemic threat to the entire nation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand what is happening in Iran's current crisis, we really first have to understand the science of regime change you just mentioned.
Yeah, transitology.
Transitology, right. When political scientists look at how regimes actually collapse and reform, how do they view the mechanics of navigating this gray zone?
So transitology essentially looks at the mechanics of how nations move from autocracy to democracy. And a huge part of that is analyzing crisis management frameworks.
Okay, so like how they put out the fires.
Well, exactly. But when political scientists look at how regimes survive collapse, they realize reacting to the fire doesn't actually work. The literature points to three dominant models. First, you have the reactive model, which is responding only after a crisis hits.
Right.
Second is the preventative model, where you try to identify and mitigate risks beforehand. But modern scholarship heavily favors the third approach, which is the resilience-based model.
Resilience-based.
Yeah, the only nations that survive the gray zone are the ones that built fireproof rooms beforehand, so to speak. It's about building the adaptive capacity within your institutions to absorb massive shocks without the entire state just collapsing.
Got it. And when we talk about resilience in this context, the sources highlight a really crucial distinction between onset resilience and breakdown resilience.
Right, yeah. Onset resilience is a system's ability to prevent democratic decline from starting in the first place.
So like a healthy immune system washing its hands to avoid catching a virus.
That's a great way to put it. Breakdown resilience is entirely different, though. Breakdown resilience is having the hospital infrastructure, the ICU beds, the ventilators, having all of that ready to keep the patient alive once they already have double pneumonia.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's the ability to avoid total regime collapse once a decline has already begun. And the data shows that once a country starts sliding backward, only 1 in 5 democracies manages to avert a total breakdown.
Just 1 in 5.
Yeah. But in the case of Iran, we aren't looking at a failing democracy. We're looking at a highly resilient authoritarian system.
Right, because the academic papers describe Iran as being trapped in this indefinite and painful transition. And this isn't a new struggle for them at all, right?
No, not at all. Iran has faced a century-long struggle marked by interrupted democratizations. I mean, you have the 1906 constitutional revolution, which established a parliament but was ultimately derailed. And then, crucially, you have the 1953 coup. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh attempted to nationalize Iran's oil and establish democratic norms, but he was overthrown.
And our sources explicitly detail how that 1953 coup was orchestrated by the CIA and MI6.
Yes.
Which gave future autocrats the ultimate, foreign interference cheat code.
That is exactly the legacy it left. It provided future authoritarian leaders in Iran with the perfect narrative.
Right, a built-in excuse.
Exactly. Any domestic push for democracy, any demand for civil rights could instantly be delegitimized and branded as Western sabotage.
But wait, hold on. 1979 wasn't a peaceful handover. They literally overthrew the Shah.
Yes, as they
By definition, that's removing an autocrat through a massive popular uprising. So why didn't that trigger the democratic transition we're talking about?
So the 1979 revolution was a moment where human agency really triumphed over a monarchy. But the regime that replaced it was founded on a very unique exception.
What exception?
It was built on the doctrine of velayat-e-faqih, which roughly translates to the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, or clerical supremacy.
Right.
So while the revolution brought together this huge, diverse coalition, secular leftists, students, traditional merchants, the clerical class, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, they had the organizational discipline to quickly sideline those democratic allies.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, they established a system where religious authority had absolute veto power over civilian government. They essentially froze the transition, just trapping the country in that permanent gray zone.
Right. And if we want to understand why 1979 stalled out, we have to look at the structural roadblocks holding that gray zone in place today.
Definitely.
We really have to look at how the Iranian state is actually built, right down to the studs. The sources call it a dual state.
Yeah, it's the Janus-faced nature of Iran's government. It operates with a Republican facade on one side and a theocratic absolute on the other.
Okay.
You have an elected president and a parliament, which is known as the Majlis, but they are entirely subordinated to unelected bodies, specifically the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council.
And the Guardian Council vets all candidates for those quote-unquote elected offices.
Exactly, which means they ensure that only regime loyalists can even run in the first place. You can vote, sure, but you can only vote for the candidates the autocracy pre-approves.
It's a system literally designed to look democratic while structurally preventing any actual democratic change.
Right.
But the roadblock isn't just political, it is deeply economic. Our economic analyses describe Iran not as a traditional state-run economy, but as a subcontractor state.
Yeah, power and wealth in Iran are decentralized, but absolutely not into the hands of the public.
Where do they go?
They're decentralized into semi-public entities. The two biggest players are the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and the Bonyads.
Right, the Bonyads. The sources note that these were originally set up as charitable foundations after the 1979 revolution. The stated goal was to take the vast wealth of the deposed royal family and, redistribute it to the poor and to war veterans.
What's fascinating here is how these organizations fundamentally mutated. These bonyads evolved into completely opaque, untaxed conglomerates.
Wow.
To understand how insidious this is, a bonyad doesn't just run a charity. A single bonyad might own the cement factory, the trucking company that moves the cement, and the construction firm that builds the high-rises.
So they own the whole supply chain.
Exactly. They outcompete any private citizen because they pay no taxes, operate with almost zero public accountability, and they have the violent backing of the state. They became these massive patronage networks for the clerical elite.
But wait, I was reading in the sources about the 1990s and 2000s, specifically under President Ahmadinejad. Didn't Iran go through a massive privatization phase? Shouldn't that have weakened state control and helped build an independent middle class?
You would think so, but the sources actually categorize that period as pseudo-privatization. The state didn't sell assets to independent citizens or private entrepreneurs. It's less like privatization and more like a mafia bust-out. The state officially sold the public assets, but they only sold them to holding companies controlled by their own enforcers, the IRGC and the Bonyads.
So they just changed the names on the deeds, but the regime kept all the wealth.
Precisely. And by doing this, they deeply militarized the economy. It allowed the regime to bypass Western sanctions through covert financial channels.
Right, the shadow fleets.
Yes. The IRGC operates massive shadow fleets of oil tankers. They turn off transponders, conduct ship-to-ship transfers out at sea, and sell discounted oil to allied nations.
And they keep the profits.
The IRGC and the Bonyads reap the massive financial benefits of the shadow economy while completely socializing the catastrophic cost of the economic isolation onto the regular Iranian people.
Well, if all the wealth is being siphoned off by the IRGC and these bonyads, the public must be starving. How is the economy actually holding up under that parasite structure?
It isn't. It really isn't. The numbers coming out of the 2025 and 2026 intelligence and economic data are just staggering. We're looking at a system pushed way beyond its breaking point.
Yeah.
Inflation has hit a peak of 68%. The currency has utterly collapsed. It's now sitting at 1.4 million rial to a single US dollar.
1.4 million. Let's just pause on that number for you listening. If you are a middle-class family trying to buy a week's worth of groceries or, trying to find asthma medication for your kid, your savings are completely vaporized.
Vaporized. And the human cost of that is the absolute decimation of the middle class. Without decades of sanctions and internal mismanagement, projections showed Iran's middle class should have been around 84% of the population.
Where is it now?
Today, it has shrunk to just 56%. You have highly educated professionals, engineers, and doctors driving taxis just to make rent, with millions falling entirely below the poverty line.
That economic devastation must fundamentally change the nature of the protests we're seeing in the streets.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look back at 2022, the tragic death of Mahsa Amini sparked nationwide protests that were largely driven by sociocultural rights.
Right. Bodily autonomy, women's rights, opposition to the morality police.
Exactly. But the 2025 and 2026 uprisings feel fundamentally different.
They are. They're driven by sheer economic survival, which makes them incredibly dangerous for the regime. The economic desperation has united disparate groups that historically, they don't protest together.
Who are we talking about?
You have industrial workers going on strike, university students rallying, and crucially, the traditional bazaar merchants who are the historical economic engine of the country, all marching together against the state.
And the regime's response has just been brutal containment. Our sources note that in early 2026 alone, up to 6,800 civilians have been killed by security forces.
Yeah.
It's a staggering level of state violence designed purely to terrorize the public into submission.
Right.
But despite all of that force, there is an even bigger catalyst looming over everything right now, which is the succession crisis.
Right, because Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is 86 years old, and his public appearances have dwindled significantly. His departure will trigger only the second leadership change in the nearly 50-year history of the Islamic Republic, and the intelligence reports outlined 3 potential scenarios for how this plays out.
Okay, what's the first one?
Scenario 1 is managed continuity. The clerical establishment manages to install a loyalist to keep the current system running, someone like Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, or maybe the Chief Justice, EJ.
Right.
But placing an untested leader atop a highly volatile, economically ruined state is incredibly risky. Scenario 2 is a military takeover,
Where the IRGC drops the religious pretense entirely.
formally seizing power and relying purely on military force for legitimacy. This would essentially be authoritarianism 2.0, looking very similar to the military-led states we've seen in places like Egypt or Pakistan.
And the third scenario outlined in the reports is regime collapse. Mass uprisings overwhelm the security forces, and the state totally disintegrates.
Yes.
But wait, looking at it from the outside, regime collapse sounds like exactly what the protesters in the streets are asking for. Isn't tearing the whole corrupt system down the absolute prerequisite to starting over?
It's a natural assumption, sure, but the transitology scholars and the comparative case studies from the Arab Spring tell a much darker story about the mechanics of collapse.
Really?
Yeah. Total collapse without a structured transition is incredibly perilous.
Why is it so dangerous?
Look at Libya. The violent overthrow of Gaddafi led to the total disintegration of state institutions and the military. It created a massive power vacuum.
And what fills the vacuum?
Exactly. Non-state armed groups, militias, and warlords fighting for control over the rubble. You get a fractured state and brutal civil conflict.
Wow. Yeah.
The lesson from transitology is that to achieve democracy, you cannot just survive the collapse of an autocracy. You have to actively manage the crisis of transition. You need institutional continuity.
So keeping the lights on, keeping the hospitals running.
Maintaining physical security, just without the ideological dictators at the top.
Well, if total collapse is a disaster and an IRGC military takeover just gives you authoritarianism 2.0,
Yeah.
how does a transition actually happen? How do you navigate this gray zone and arrive at a democratic outcome?
Before we look at the political roadmaps, we have to look at the security forces. Because historically, the military is the ultimate swing factor.
Oh.
The sources point to Tunisia's initially successful transition during the Arab Spring. Why did it work? Because the regular Tunisian military remained neutral. They didn't intervene to save the dictator, and they didn't seize power for themselves.
So in Iran, a successful transition heavily relies on the regular military, the Artesh remaining neutral, and refusing to join the IRGC in a violent crackdown or a coup.
Precisely. If the security forces fracture, or if the regular army refuses to fire on civilians, it creates the physical opening required for a civilian-led transition.
Assuming that opening happens, looking at the opposition plans in our stack of reports, there are 2 competing blueprints for the day after. And I want to make it super clear for you listening, we're not taking sides here.
No, absolutely not.
We are just completely impartially reporting on the structural pros and cons of these plans based strictly on the source material.
Right. So the first is the NCRI, or the 10-point plan, proposed by Maryam Rajavi. The sources describe this as a framework focused on establishing a secular democratic republic. It calls for the separation of religion and state, gender equality, an independent judiciary, and a non-nuclear Iran. From a transitology perspective, what the academic sources praise about this plan is its procedural nature.
Meaning it focuses on the rules of the game rather than who is actually playing.
Yes. It doesn't focus on appointing a specific ruler. It focuses on bounded timelines and institutional processes meant strictly to organize free elections and a constituent assembly.
Got it.
It avoids personalizing authority, which is critical when you're trying to dismantle a dictatorship.
Now, the second major framework is the Iran Prosperity Project, or IPP, which is backed by Reza Pahlavi. This plan involves a 180-day emergency phase.
Right.
During the 6-month period, the transition is managed by 3 bodies. A transitional legislature called the Mehestan, a judiciary called the Divan, and an executive government. This all leads to a national referendum where Iranians choose between a republic and a parliamentary monarchy.
However, the sources note significant criticisms regarding the structure of the IPP. The concern is that during this highly volatile 180-day emergency phase, the plan operates under the leadership of a single, unelected transitional leader.
I see the risk there.
Yeah, scholars warn that concentrating that much authority in one individual, even temporarily, risks reproducing the very concentration of power that the transition is supposed to dismantle. It creates a massive temptation for that leader to simply cancel the elections and stay in power.
It's great to have a 10-point plan or a 180-day emergency phase, but, I mean, if the IRGC and the bonyads hold all the guns and all the money, how does a transitional government actually take control of the country? How do they enforce these blueprints?
That is the ultimate question. And regardless of which political group manages the pivot, the economic and institutional prescriptions required to actually seize control are largely the same.
Which are?
First, immediate fiscal discipline to halt the hyperinflation and stabilize the currency so people can literally eat. Second, what the sources call the outsider privatization of the bonyads.
Meaning you have to physically rip those massive conglomerates out of the hands of the elite patronage networks.
You have to subject them to public auditing, break up their monopolies, and force them into real market competition. You have to dismantle the subcontractor state so the government actually controls the national economy again.
Right.
And finally, there must be a constitutional referendum to definitively end the dual structure of government. The clerical hierarchy must be constitutionally subordinated to representative democratic government. You just cannot have unelected bodies vetting candidates and vetoing the will of the people.
It's almost like comparing 2 different types of emergency surgery.
Oh.
Yeah, one plan wants to assemble a team of specialists bound by a strict procedural timeline before handing the hospital back to the public. The other plan wants to bring in a single lead surgeon with emergency executive powers to stabilize the room first. But either way, the patient, which is Iran's economy and institutions, is currently bleeding out on the operating table, and the parasite feeding on it has to be removed.
That is a very, very accurate way to visualize the tension there.
So what does this all mean? When we pull back and look at the immediate geopolitical stakes of these transition plans, well, why is the entire world watching Iran so closely in 2026?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is absolutely not just a domestic issue.
No.
The fate of Iran's transition impacts the entire globe. The sources remind us of Iran's extensive network of proxy militias across the Middle East, its advancing nuclear dossier, and of course the recent 2026 military strikes by the U.S. and Israel.
The whole region is a tinderbox.
It really is. A failed transition in Iran, whether that's a descent into civil war or a hyper-aggressive IRGC military dictatorship, could fatally destabilize global shipping routes, send global energy markets into absolute chaos, and ignite a wider regional conflict.
Wow.
Resolving Iran's crisis structurally and peacefully is pivotal for international security.
To summarize what we've unpacked today for you listening, transitions from authoritarianism are rarely clean breaks. They don't happen overnight, and they definitely don't happen just because a dictator falls.
No, they don't.
Surviving the gray zone requires incredibly deep institutional and economic restructuring. It requires irregular security forces to remain neutral, and it requires a transition plan that avoids the temptation of replacing one dictator with another. It requires immense societal resilience.
It is the ultimate test of a nation's civic fabric.
We've seen throughout this deep dive how structural forces, billions of dollars in shadow money, the military dominance of the IRGC, decades-old institutions designed to subvert democracy, how all of that can trap a nation in autocracy.
Yeah.
But as we watch the people of Iran risk absolutely everything in the streets in 2026, I want you to ask yourself this. In the ultimate battle between the rigid, calculated structures of a state and the sheer collective willpower of its citizens, well, which one actually breaks first?